The sensation of solid ground beneath my boots was jarring, almost insulting. For 5 years, the world had been a constant, unpredictable sway. The cold, vibrating steel of a destroyer deck, the rhythmic groan of the hull cutting through endless blue. Now, standing on the tarmac of the small regional airport in upstate New York, the earth felt impossibly still, stubbornly fixed. I inhaled deeply, trying to purge the persistent scent of salt, diesel, and stale air conditioning that had clung to my uniform for half a decade. The air here was sharp, clean, and carried the unmistakable vital aroma of pine, damp earth, and the icy promise of Lake Ontario. This was the true scent of home, and it hit me with the force of a physical blow, simultaneously overwhelming me with relief and fear. I had spent my entire deployment, through 3 tours, 2 hostile zones, and countless 3 a.m. watch shifts, clinging to a single static image. George. My grandfather, my anchor, waiting for me on the wide shingled porch of the lakeside house. I could see him perfectly in my mind's eye, his old flannel shirt, the laugh lines crinkling around his eyes as he pulled me into a hug that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and varnish. "We'll take the Wanderer out the day you get back, Sarah," he'd promised in his last letter. "She's been sitting patiently, waiting for her captain. It's high time I teach you how to handle that old family sloop properly." That promise had been my lifeline. George was the only family I truly had left. My father had died tragically when I was young, and my mother, Eleanor, had quickly remarried and moved on, treating me more like a bureaucratic inconvenience than a daughter. George, however, had stayed. He had raised me on the lake, teaching me celestial navigation using stars I later used professionally, and grounding me with his quiet, unwavering love. I picked up the keys to the rental car, a painfully generic sedan that felt alien after months in military transport, and started the final leg of the journey. I drove faster than I should have, the speed limit signs blurring into streaks of white and black. Every mile I devoured felt like shedding another layer of the uniform I was desperate to escape. The landscape changed from strip malls and industrial parks to dense forests and winding 2-lane roads flanked by centuries-old stone walls. The familiar route was a map etched into my soul. I remembered every dip in the road, every sudden view of the water through the trees. My anticipation was a physical ache in my chest, a giddy, almost unbearable excitement that made my hands tremble on the wheel. I was finally coming home. The deployment was over. The future stretched out, peaceful and domestic, filled with the simple, promised rhythm of life with George. When I finally rounded the last, tight bend, the one that always opened onto the sweeping vista of the lake, and saw the sprawling, gray-shingled house nestled perfectly by the water, a wave of pure, absolute relief washed over me. I wanted to cry out loud. It was exactly as I remembered it, solid and welcoming, a beacon against the darkening afternoon sky. But as I slowed the car, the relief curdled instantly into a sickening dread. Something was wrong. Terribly, profoundly wrong. The porch lights were off, which was unusual for George, who was meticulous about lighting the long path down to the dock. More importantly, George's ancient, rust-flecked Ford F-150, which had been parked in the same spot for 20 years, was gone. In its place sat a sleek, obsidian-black luxury sedan, a model I didn't recognize, certainly not something George would ever own. Its presence felt arrogant, foreign, and deeply unsettling. I pulled the rental onto the gravel driveway, the crunching sound unnaturally loud in the silence. I killed the engine, but I didn't move immediately. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to rationalize the anomaly. Maybe George was visiting a neighbor? Maybe he borrowed a friend's car? But the house felt too quiet, too still. It was a silence that wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, expectant. I finally forced myself out of the car. My duffel bag, packed with the minimal necessities of a returned sailor, felt suddenly leaden on my shoulder. I didn't even bother trying to retrieve the house key from the magnetized box hidden under the porch steps. I needed answers now. I walked the few steps to the front door, my heart pounding a frantic, nervous rhythm against my ribs, a tempo that instantly superseded the steady, controlled beat of a sailor accustomed to crisis. I didn't even have time to lift my hand to knock before the door swung inward. Standing framed in the doorway, blocking my entry, was Eleanor, my stepmother. I hadn't seen her in person since my high school graduation, though she occasionally sent sterile, formal holiday cards. The Eleanor I remembered was perpetually stressed, draped in threadbare cashmere and muted colors. This woman was different. She was clad in a silk dress of a deep sapphire blue, tailored perfectly, and accessorized with jewelry that glittered expensively even in the dim light. Her blonde hair, usually haphazardly pinned up, was now perfectly coiffed, a helmet of artificial perfection. But it was her expression that froze me. It wasn't the expected guilt, or even the mild irritation she usually reserved for me. It was worse. A cold, detached amusement, a triumphant gleam in her pale eyes that instantly put me on high alert. "Well, look who finally decided to grace us with her presence," she drawled, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that only amplified the venom beneath. She leaned against the doorframe, making no move to let me in. I ignored the hostility, pushing past the immediate instinct to argue. My only priority was George. "Where's Grandpa George?" I demanded, stepping past the threshold and into the familiar yet suddenly altered foyer. "Is he inside? I didn't call ahead. I wanted to surprise him." Eleanor didn't flinch at my urgency. She simply straightened up, crossing her newly braceleted arms over her chest. The diamond tennis bracelet caught the light, sparkling mockingly. "You just missed him, dear," she stated, her tone maddeningly casual, as if discussing a late train. "By quite a few weeks, actually." The words didn't make sense. They didn't fit the reality I had constructed in my mind for 5 years. Missed him? Weeks? George didn't go anywhere without telling me. "What are you talking about, Eleanor?" I demanded, my naval training suddenly failing me, the carefully constructed composure of years at sea fracturing. My voice shook, betraying the sudden, sharp fear that had replaced my joy. She sighed, a dramatic, performative sound, as if I were a tiresome child who couldn't grasp a simple concept. "George died," she said, her voice utterly flat, devoid of any genuine sorrow. "Sudden heart attack. It was quite quick, really. We buried him 3 weeks ago. It was a private affair, of course. Very quiet." The world tilted. It wasn't a metaphor. The solid ground I had just celebrated standing on seemed to shift beneath my feet, mimicking the relentless roll of the destroyer. The air rushed out of my lungs, leaving me grappling for breath in the sudden, terrifying vacuum. George. Gone. The shock was a physical force, a brutal, paralyzing blow to my solar plexus. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me lightheaded, nauseous, and frighteningly cold despite the warmth of the house. My rock, my foundation, the one person who had tethered me to this earth, was gone, and she was telling me this now, standing in the doorway dressed in silk, 3 weeks after the fact. You didn't tell me," I whispered, the sound barely audible, choked off by the sudden, overwhelming pressure in my throat. I stared at her, searching for some flicker of remorse, some sign of human empathy in her eyes. I found nothing but polished, impenetrable indifference. Eleanor lifted one shoulder in the slightest of shrugs, adjusting the expensive fabric of her dress. "Why disrupt your service, Sarah?" she asked, her voice carrying a sickening implication of practicality. "You were thousands of miles away, completely unreachable for days at a time. It's not like you could have made it back in time anyway. What good would the news have done you? It would have just been a distraction. A distraction. My grandfather's death, the end of my entire childhood world, was merely a potential distraction to my stepmother. The indifference was a physical violation, far more painful than the news itself. I had returned home expecting a hug, a welcoming smile, and instead I found a graveyard, guarded by a stranger who had deliberately kept me out of the final, sacred moments of George's life. She had stolen my chance to say goodbye. She had robbed me of the right to mourn. The tears that had been threatening finally broke free, hot and stinging. But they were not just tears of grief. They were tears of raw, furious betrayal. He was my family, I managed, my voice cracking, yet laced with a dangerous edge of anger. He was everything to me. How dare you make that decision for me? How dare you bury him without telling me? Eleanor merely sighed again, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling as if appealing to an unseen, sympathetic audience for patience. Honestly, Sarah, always so dramatic, she muttered. It was a simple, necessary choice. The funeral was small. We invited the neighbors and the vestry. It was done quickly. Now, if you're done with the histrionics, perhaps you can tell me how long you intend to stay. I have an appointment with the interior designer tomorrow morning, and I need this place to be quiet. I took a step back, reeling from the sheer callousness. Interior designer? George's body wasn't even cold in the ground, and she was already planning renovations. The image of the Wanderer, the sailboat George and I were supposed to sail together, flashed through my mind, a cruel, impossible ghost of a promise. I was devastated, heartbroken, and suddenly, profoundly alone in the only place I had ever considered home. The silence of the house, once a comfort, now felt like a vast, echoing tomb, Eleanor standing sentinel over the ruins of my life. I had survived 5 years of deployment only to find that the war I needed to fight was waiting for me right here, in my own living room. I needed details, I needed confirmation, and most of all, I needed to know what else she had taken from me. The anticipation of home had violently collided with the devastating reality of betrayal, leaving me shattered and gasping for air in the foyer. The long way home had ended, not in relief, but in utter freezing shock. The air in the living room was thick, suffocating, and strangely sterile. It lacked the familiar scent of pipe tobacco and old books that George always carried, a smell I had cherished and carried in my memory through 5 years of salt spray and diesel fumes. Now, the house smelled of expensive, unfamiliar perfume and dust, the kind of dust that settles on things that haven't been truly lived with. I sat down heavily in the large, worn leather armchair by the fireplace, the one George claimed was broken in just right. I didn't ask permission. I simply needed the solid weight of something familiar beneath me, a tether against the vertigo of this sudden, devastating news. "Tell me everything," I commanded, my voice flat, devoid of the tremor it held moments before. Years of naval discipline snapped back into place, forcing a clinical calm over the churning panic in my gut. I needed facts, not feelings. Eleanor, however, seemed perfectly content to ignore my authority. She had retreated to the pristine, newly renovated kitchen counter, sipping from a tall crystal glass. She didn't offer me anything. Not water, not sympathy, not even a chair. She was already staking her claim, asserting her dominance in this space that should have welcomed me home. "There isn't much to tell, Sarah," she drawled, examining her manicured nails. It was very fast. George was pruning the roses. You know how obsessed he was with those prize-winning hybrids, and he just collapsed. The doctor said it was instantaneous, a massive coronary event. I felt a sharp stab of pain. Pruning the roses. That was so him. The image of his large, calloused hands, usually so steady on the tiller or tying a knot, falling suddenly still in the dirt was unbearable. "When exactly?" I pushed. "Give me the date." She sighed, clearly irritated by my persistence. "The 23rd of September, 3 weeks and 4 days ago. Does the exact date really matter, darling? You were miles away." The deliberate cruelty of that last phrase hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just stating a fact. She was rubbing the salt of my absence into the wound of his death. She was implying that my duty, my commitment to the Navy, was a choice that cost me my grandfather's final moments. "Who was there?" I whispered, fighting to keep the raw emotion out of my voice. "Who did he talk to last? Did he say anything about me?" Eleanor shrugged, an elegant, dismissive movement. "The gardener found him. The funeral was small, private, just a few neighbors and myself. Really, Sarah, it was a closed casket. There wasn't much to see. A closed casket. That detail was a fresh wave of agony. I was denied the chance to see his face one last time, to say goodbye, to confirm that he truly was gone. She had managed the entire process, from death to burial, in a tidy, efficient manner, ensuring no messy loose ends, ensuring I was not one of those loose ends. "Why didn't you call my commanding officer?" I demanded, rising halfway out of the chair, my hands clenching into fists. "You know the procedure. A death in the immediate family warrants emergency leave. You had my deployment contact information." Her eyes finally met mine, and there was no warmth there, only a cold, calculated indifference. "And disrupt your service for a formality? You couldn't have made it back in time for the burial anyway, not really. And frankly, the stress of coordinating everything was enough. I handled it. I handled it." That was the key phrase. She hadn't kept me away out of consideration. She had kept me away out of convenience. She had stolen my right to mourn, my right to be present, and my right to closure. The grief I felt began to sour, twisting into a hot, corrosive anger. I walked over to the mantelpiece. George's favorite ship clock was still there, ticking loudly, but the bronze was newly polished, almost gleaming. Next to it, a picture of George and me sailing the sloop was gone, replaced by a tasteless modern ceramic vase. She was systematically purging his memory, replacing his life with her aesthetic. The realization crystallized. This wasn't just neglect or indifference. This was calculated malice. She had hidden his death to keep me away, to ensure she had unchallenged control over the immediate aftermath. I was still standing by the mantelpiece, my back rigid, when Eleanor returned to the living room, carrying a thick, legal file folder. The change in her demeanor was immediate and chilling. The facade of the indifferent stepmother dropped, replaced by the razor sharpness of a corporate lawyer. "We need to discuss the estate," she announced, her voice crisp and professional. She placed the heavy folder on the glass coffee table with a decisive thud. "George updated his will quite recently, just before his passing. It's all settled." My heart, which had been beating a slow, mournful rhythm, suddenly accelerated, pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Updated his will. The phrase was ominous. George and I had spoken countless times about the house, about the land, about the future. He always said this place was my birthright, my inheritance from the Vance line. I forced myself to sit down again, trying to appear composed, though my hands were shaking slightly. I picked up the document. It was bound professionally, signed, dated, and notarized. It looked perfectly legitimate. I scanned the pages, my eyes darting across the dense, sterile language. The first few clauses dealt with standard financial obligations, but then I reached the critical section regarding real property and assets. I read the section 3 times, the words blurring, refusing to make sense. "I hereby bequeath the entirety of my real and personal property, including but not limited to the property located at 144 Lakeview Drive, all associated bank accounts and investments, to my daughter-in-law, Eleanor Vance." My name was absent, completely and utterly erased. I looked up at Eleanor, who was watching me with an expression of predatory satisfaction. "This is impossible," I choked out, pushing the document away as if it were contaminated. "He wouldn't do this. He promised me the house. He promised me the land. We had a plan. This must be a mistake." Eleanor leaned forward, resting her elbows on her perfectly crossed knees. Her smile was thin and genuinely malicious. She was wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that glittered under the lamplight, a bracelet I knew George could never have afforded, or, frankly, would have ever bought for her. It was new money, her money, or perhaps my money. "People change their minds, dear," she repeated the earlier cruel phrase, savoring it this time. "Especially when they realize who is actually present in their lives. I spent the last 2 years here, managing his affairs, taking care of him. You were off playing sailor on the other side of the world. The implication was clear. I abandoned him, and he punished me for it. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, that it eclipsed the grief for a moment. George was a man of his word. He was the most honorable person I had ever known. He would never, ever have gone back on a promise, especially one concerning my future and the family legacy. This document felt like a lie, a carefully constructed forgery of his intentions. He was pressured, I stated, the realization hitting me with the force of a rogue wave. You forced him to sign this. He was frail, he was ill. You took advantage of him. Eleanor laughed, a brittle, unpleasant sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. Prove it, Sarah. It's legally binding. Signed, witnessed, notarized. The court will agree that I was the primary caregiver. She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting me drown in the hopelessness of the situation. I was a sailor, a woman who understood logistics and combat, but I was utterly lost in the treacherous waters of probate law and domestic manipulation. Then came the final crushing blow, the token, the ultimate symbol of my erasure. Eleanor stood up and walked over to a high shelf I hadn't noticed. She retrieved a small scuffed wooden box. It was George's old fishing tackle box, the one he carried religiously every summer out onto the lake. It was heavy with the scent of lake water, dried minnows, and oil. She slid the box across the coffee table towards me, stopping just short of my reach. However, she said, her voice dripping with false magnanimity, George did leave you a small token, something sentimental, perhaps. I stared at the box. My eyes traced the initials GV carved deeply into the lid. Inside, she continued, gesturing vaguely, are his old handmade fishing lures. He spent hours on those. They meant the world to him, and I know they mean nothing to anyone else. Consider it your inheritance. My inheritance, the house, the land, the boat, the savings, all gone. Replaced by a box of dusty metal hooks and feathers. The raw grief I had been holding back finally combusted into a searing, white-hot fury. She wasn't just stealing the property, she was mocking the deepest, most cherished memories I shared with George. She reduced our entire relationship, our history, our shared love for the lake and the outdoors, to a handful of worthless trinkets. I gripped the sides of George's armchair, my knuckles turning bone white. My breathing was ragged. I wanted to smash the glass table, to grab her by the expensive silk collar of her dress, and demand to know how she could be so utterly devoid of a soul. Now, Eleanor said, oblivious or perhaps enjoying my silent disintegration, if you'll excuse me, I need to call the landscapers. I plan on redesigning the back garden next week. I think a modern stone patio would be lovely where that overgrown vegetable patch used to be. That was the breaking point. The vegetable patch was George's pride and joy. It was where we harvested tomatoes every August. She wasn't just renovating, she was systematically destroying every physical trace of his existence, and mine by extension. I realized I was standing in her house, breathing her air, surrounded by the spoils of her victory. I was a trespasser. I had no leverage, no home, and no place to even lay my head. If I stayed another minute, I would lose control, and I couldn't afford to be the violent, grieving fool she wanted me to be. I pushed myself away from the chair. I didn't speak. My throat was tight with suppressed rage, and I knew any word I uttered would be a scream. I snatched the wooden tackle box off the table. The weight of it felt like a betrayal and a burden all at once. I walked past Eleanor, my gaze fixed on the front door. "Where are you going, dear?" she called out, her voice laced with mock concern. "Don't you want to stay for dinner? I'm having the cook prepare something light." I didn't answer. I didn't look back. I walked down the hall and straight out the front door, pulling my small duffel bag off the floor where I had dropped it hours earlier. The cold autumn air hit my face, shocking me back to a semblance of reality. I got into the rental car, throwing the duffel bag and the tackle box onto the passenger seat. I started the engine, the roar momentarily drowning out the frantic drumming of my heart. As I backed out of the driveway, I glanced one last time at the house. It was magnificent, warm, and comforting, yet now it was a cold, impenetrable fortress. I was utterly alone, cut off from my family, my legacy, and my past. Eleanor had won the immediate battle. She had erased me. But as I sped away from the lake, the weight of the wooden box beside me felt less like an insult and more like a challenge. George had loved those lures. He had touched that wood. This was not the end. The raw, searing pain of betrayal was hardening into a fierce, focused resolve. I might be homeless, but I was not defeated. I needed a plan, and I needed to find a place where Eleanor's cold shadow could not reach me. I drove blindly, needing sanctuary, needing answers that only the past could provide. I knew exactly one place she would never dare to tread: St. Jude's Church. The air in the house had become a physical thing, thick and suffocating, poisoned by Eleanor's triumphant presence. I couldn't breathe under the same roof as her smug certainty. The silence, after her final cutting remarks about the landscapers, was worse than any shouted argument. It was the silence of victory. I grabbed my duffel bag, the same worn canvas bag that had traveled with me across 3 oceans, and started stuffing the few civilian clothes I owned. I moved fast, driven by a primal need to escape, to put distance between myself and the woman who had not only hidden my grandfather's death, but was now actively dismantling his memory. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph, suddenly felt defiled. I looked at the small, dusty wooden tackle box resting on the mantelpiece, the so-called inheritance. It was worthless to Eleanor, but to me, it was a lifeline. George's hands had crafted those lures. His scent, pine needles, and pipe tobacco still clung faintly to the aged wood. I picked it up, cradling it carefully, a small, defiant gesture against the erasure Eleanor was attempting. This was the only tangible piece of George she hadn't managed to steal or sell yet. I didn't bother saying goodbye or even acknowledging her existence. She was probably already on the phone with a realtor, discussing how quickly she could flip the property now that the legal unpleasantness was settled. I walked out the front door, closing it softly, not wanting to give her the satisfaction of hearing the slam. The rental car felt like a sanctuary, a temporary metal shell separating me from the brutal reality inside that shingled house. I placed the tackle box on the passenger seat, buckled up, and peeled out of the driveway, the tires crunching gravel in a satisfying, angry spray. Where was I supposed to go? I was a sailor who had just returned from 5 years at sea, prepared for a reunion, only to find myself homeless, disinherited, and utterly alone in my grief. I had no furniture, no lease, and no family left who cared enough to open their door. The military had prepared me for combat, for survival in hostile environments, but it had not prepared me for this specific, cold-blooded domestic betrayal. I drove aimlessly for a few minutes, the lake flashing darkly between the tall pines. I needed sanctuary. I needed a place where the scent of Eleanor's expensive perfume and the sound of her calculating voice couldn't reach me. I needed George. My instincts, honed by years of navigating by the stars, guided me to the only place she had never dared to tread: St. Jude's. It was a small, historic stone church nestled deep within the village center, sheltered by ancient oaks. George had been a pillar of that church. He had served on the vestry, organized the annual pancake breakfast, and every Sunday, without fail, he was there. Eleanor, predictably, had found the services too provincial and the congregation too common for her refined tastes. When I pulled into the small gravel parking lot, the autumn evening had already settled in, painting the sky a deep, bruised purple. The church was dark, save for a single dim security light above the side entrance. I hesitated for a moment, suddenly unsure if I had the right to intrude on this sacred silence. I pushed open the heavy oak doors. They groaned in protest, the sound echoing loudly in the immense, quiet space. The air inside smelled of beeswax, old paper, and something faintly metallic. the smell of history and solemnity. I walked slowly down the central aisle. My boots, usually a source of confidence and authority, felt heavy, leaden. Every step was a struggle against the crushing weight of everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. I found the third pew from the front, right side, George's pew. I slid into the worn wooden seat, the familiar indentation comforting beneath me. This was where he sat every week, his hand resting on the smooth wood, listening to the sermons. I pressed my face into my hands and finally, mercifully, let go. The grief hit me not as a slow wave, but as a violent physical breaking. I sobbed, deep, ragged, uncontrollable sounds that were immediately swallowed by the vaulted ceiling. I cried for George, for the 5 years of missed sunsets and conversations, for the reunion that would never happen. But mostly, I cried for the brutal, cold-hearted way Eleanor had stolen his last moments from me, and then, with cruel indifference, tried to erase my existence from his life entirely. I felt abandoned. I felt like George had, in his final moments, truly forgotten the promises we had made. The will Eleanor presented was a testament to my failure, or perhaps to George's sudden, inexplicable change of heart. The injustice was a searing, raw ache in my chest that had nothing to do with naval discipline or strategy. I was just a heartbroken granddaughter, lost and utterly powerless. I don't know how long I sat there, curled into myself, letting the despair wash over me. Time ceased to exist in the quiet darkness of the sanctuary. I felt like a shipwreck survivor who had finally reached a desolate shore, only to realize there was no rescue coming. Then I heard it. Soft, measured footsteps on the stone floor approaching from the sacristy. I quickly wiped the tears from my eyes, embarrassed by the raw display of emotion. I tried to regain my composure, sitting ramrod straight, forcing my breathing to regulate. "Sarah?" a gentle voice asked, laced with immediate recognition and concern. I looked up and saw Pastor Miller. He was a man defined by kindness, his face etched with deep, warm wrinkles that crinkled when he smiled. Tonight, however, his expression was one of profound sorrow. His shock of white hair seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. He didn't rush me. He simply sat down beside me on the hard wooden pew, leaving a respectful distance, allowing me the silence I needed to gather myself. "I am so terribly sorry, my dear," he finally said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "I heard you were back. I was praying for you." I nodded numbly, unable to speak. "It was a terrible shock to the whole community," he continued, speaking of George. "But I knew it would be worse for you, arriving home to such news." "Pastor?" I managed, my voice hoarse and unfamiliar. "Eleanor, she hid it. She buried him 3 weeks ago and didn't tell me. And she says he changed his will. She took the house. She left me nothing but a box of old lures." The words tumbled out, jagged and bitter. "I don't even have a place to mourn him properly." Pastor Miller listened patiently, his gaze fixed on the empty space where the altar usually held the communion elements. He nodded slowly, thoughtfully, processing my account of the betrayal. "George was an exceptionally careful man, Sarah," he said, finally turning to me, his eyes earnest and steady. "He was meticulous. He didn't trust many people, and he certainly never trusted Eleanor's sudden, aggressive interest in his finances these last few years. We talked about it often. My heart, which had been a cold, dead weight, suddenly stuttered. They talked about it. George was worried. He was worried about you being overseas," the pastor continued, lowering his voice almost to a whisper. "He said he knew that woman would try something underhanded the moment he was gone. He said she was waiting for him to pass, just like a vulture." The validation was instant, a small, fragile spark igniting in the vast darkness of my despair. George hadn't abandoned me. He had been aware of the threat. He anticipated this exact situation, the pastor confirmed, reaching slowly into the inner pocket of his worn black coat. The movement was deliberate, weighted with significance. "Months ago, George came to me. He was very specific. He said if you ever came home And only if you came home to find yourself locked out and disinherited, I was to give you this. He pulled out 2 items. The first was a thick, legal-sized manila envelope, sealed tightly with wax, bearing the stamp of a law firm I didn't recognize. The paper felt heavy, substantial, promising answers. The second object was a small, tarnished brass key. It was old, intricately cut, and had the distinctive heft of a safety deposit box key. Pastor Miller placed both objects carefully into my trembling hands. The cold brass of the key was shocking against my skin. "He made me promise, Sarah," the pastor reiterated, his eyes holding mine. "He made me swear on the Bible that I would not give this to Eleanor or to anyone else, only to you. He told me this contained his true will, Sarah, his final testament of love for his granddaughter." I stared down at the envelope and the key, completely overwhelmed. The world tilted again, but this time, not in confusion or devastation, but in a dizzying rush of relief and fierce, protective love. George had not only remembered me, he had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure his wishes were protected. He had planned, he had fought, he had anticipated her every move. The sheer foresight, the strategic genius of my grandfather, was breathtaking. He had used his faith and his friendship with the pastor as a final, unassailable defense against Eleanor's greed. My despair vanished, replaced by an electric surge of energy and resolve. I was no longer the victim weeping in the dark. I was the recipient of a sacred trust, armed with a secret weapon. I clutched the envelope and the key tightly, feeling the rough texture of the paper and the cold weight of the metal. "Thank you, Pastor," I managed, my voice thick with emotion, but steady now. "Thank you for keeping your promise." "George knew you would return, Sarah," he said softly, putting a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "He had absolute faith in you. Now you must have faith in him. Go and read what he left you. And know this, you were always his greatest treasure." I stood up, the weariness momentarily forgotten, replaced by a focused determination. The church, which had felt like a tomb moments ago, now felt like a launching pad. I had a mission, I had instructions, and I had the undeniable proof that my grandfather's love was stronger than any amount of spiteful ambition. I left the empty pew, carrying George's final silent message with me. The reckoning was not over, it was just beginning. I drove away from St. Jude's, not aimlessly, but with the specific, focused intent of a sailor charting a course toward justice. I needed to find a quiet place, a place where I could break the seal on that envelope and hear my grandfather's voice one last time. The cold, crisp air of the upstate night now felt invigorating, no longer isolating. I was ready to fight. I couldn't open the envelope in the sacred quiet of St. Jude's. The revelation George had orchestrated, the meticulous safety net he had cast across the years, felt too profound, too intimate for public display. I needed the lake, the place where our promises were made, to witness this final communication. I drove the rental car away from the village center, the streetlights fading into the deep, isolating blackness of the upstate night. My hands gripped the steering wheel, but my focus was entirely on the manila envelope resting beside me on the passenger seat, heavy with the weight of my future. The brass safety deposit box key, cold and tarnished, was tucked securely into my jeans pocket. I chose the old overlook on Route 9D. It was a winding, steep road that led to a small, rocky ledge offering a sweeping, breathtaking view of Lake Champlain. George and I used to come here in the summer, watching the distant lights of Vermont twinkle across the dark water while we planned the next season's sailing itinerary. This was our sanctuary. I parked the car, shut off the engine, and let the profound silence of the wilderness settle around me. The air was frigid, carrying the crisp, metallic scent of late autumn and damp earth. I pulled the envelope into the faint dome light of the car's interior. For 5 years, I had navigated the unforgiving vastness of the ocean, relying on training, protocol, and the strict hierarchy of the Navy. Now, I was facing a threat that was far more insidious than any storm or enemy vessel, the cold, calculated cruelty of my stepmother. Yet staring at the unbroken seal of the envelope, I felt a strange sense of calm. George had not abandoned me. He had left me a map. My fingers trembled slightly as I broke the thick wax seal. The slight tearing sound was deafening in the silence. The first item nestled inside was not a legal document, but a simple folded sheet of stationery, the kind George always used, slightly yellowed, with a faint watermark of a sailboat in the corner. His familiar cursive, always leaning slightly to the right, jumped out at me. "My dearest Sarah," it began. I stopped breathing. It was his voice, clear as the lake water on a summer morning. "If you are reading this, it means that woman has done exactly what I feared. Do not despair, my girl. I knew she would try to cut you out. I watched her, Sarah, and I didn't like the look in her eye when she spoke about my finances. It was the same look your father saw before he finally walked away from her, but I didn't have the strength to do the same in these last years. I needed her to care for me, but I didn't need to trust her with your future. I love you, and the house is yours. Always has been, always will be." Tears blurred my vision, but they were not the tears of despair I had shed in the empty church pew. These were tears of connection, of fierce, protective love that spanned the chasm of death. George saw me. He validated my gut feeling that Eleanor's sudden presence and subsequent indifference were a calculated performance. He had known her true nature, and he had fought for me, strategically and silently. I pressed the letter to my cheek, absorbing the warmth of his final, unwavering dedication. The devastating isolation I had felt since stepping off the plane evaporated, replaced by a burning sense of purpose. I was no longer the bereaved victim. I was the recipient of a mission briefing. I refocused, pulling out the remaining documents. These were not handwritten sentiments. They were dense, professionally drafted legal instruments, bound with a brass clasp. The heading, stamped in bold black ink, sent a jolt of pure electric relief through my system. Irrevocable living trust of George E. Vance. I scanned the text, my eyes trained to absorb complex information quickly, a skill honed by years of reading naval operational orders. This was no mere suggestion or promise. It was a legally impenetrable fortress. George had established this trust 6 years ago, 2 years before. Eleanor even moved back into the area following my father's death. He had seen the warning signs long before I was even deployed. The document explicitly stated that upon his death, the entire property, the house, the surrounding 20 acres of land, and the boathouse, would automatically transfer to me, Sarah Vance, as the sole and designated beneficiary. The transfer was automatic and immediate, executed by the terms of the trust itself, which was registered with the county and notarized by a reputable firm. Crucially, the trust contained a clause that shielded the property from any subsequent changes to his last will and testament. Eleanor's fraudulent will, the one she had so smugly presented, was rendered utterly meaningless concerning the real estate. It was a brilliant, preemptive strike. George hadn't just anticipated her greed, he had neutralized it with surgical precision. I found the contact information for the trustee and the drafting attorney, Mr. Harold Davies, listed prominently on the final page. His office was in Albany, a 4-hour drive from the lake. The clock read 1:30 a.m. I couldn't wait until morning. Every minute Eleanor spent sleeping under my roof, ordering landscapers for my garden, and handling my grandfather's affairs, was an insult I couldn't bear. The mission parameters were clear. Contact legal counsel immediately and execute the transfer. I started the car, the engine catching with a throaty rumble that sounded like defiance. The coffee I'd had at the church was wearing off, replaced by the adrenaline of righteous anger and the clarity of George's plan. I pulled the rental back onto the empty highway, pointing the nose south towards Albany. The long drive was a blur of highway lights and internal strategizing. My mind, usually focused on navigation and damage control on a carrier deck, was now processing legal statutes and timelines. I mentally rehearsed the conversation with Mr. Davies, structuring the facts logically: the date of deployment, the date of death, Eleanor's concealment, the presentation of the false will, and finally, the introduction of the ironclad trust. As the sun began to paint the eastern sky in hues of cold gray and pale pink, I pulled into Albany. I found a diner, grabbed a potent cup of black coffee, and waited until precisely 8 a.m. to make the call. Mr. Davies answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and professional. "Mr. Davies, my name is Sarah Vance. I am George Vance's granddaughter. I was stationed at sea when he passed, and I believe I have documents related to an irrevocable trust he established with your firm." I spoke quickly, efficiently, laying out the timeline. There was a pause on the other end, a moment of professional assessment. "Ms. Vance, I remember George well, a very sharp man. I understood he had passed recently. Yes, I drafted that trust myself. I haven't heard from the executor, a Mrs. Eleanor Vance, regarding the closure of the estate. That's because she is attempting to execute a subsequent will which names her as the sole heir," I explained, my voice tight with controlled fury. "She hid his death from me for 3 weeks and is currently occupying the house." The silence that followed was different. It was the sound of a seasoned professional comprehending the gravity of a legal offense. "Ms. Vance, I need you in my office immediately. Bring every single document you have, including that safety deposit box key. This requires immediate action." I arrived at his downtown office 30 minutes later, feeling the exhaustion of the sleepless night, but running on pure resolve. Mr. Davies was exactly what I needed: serious, meticulous, and utterly unimpressed by theatrics. I spread the documents across his mahogany desk: George's heartfelt letter, the original signed and notarized irrevocable trust, and the lawyer's contact sheet. Mr. Davies put on his reading glasses and took his time, reviewing every page. As he read the trust, a slow nod of approval spread across his face. "Ms. Vance," he said, finally leaning back, "your grandfather was brilliant. This trust is ironclad, as I told him it would be. It was registered with the state, and the property transfer was designed to be automatic upon his passing. The subsequent will Eleanor presented, even if legally executed, which we will investigate, is superseded entirely by the trust regarding the real estate. In short, Eleanor Vance has been living in your house illegally since your grandfather's death." A powerful wave of vindication washed over me. It was over. The house was mine. "What about the safety deposit box key?" I asked, sliding the tarnished brass key across the desk. "George established that box years ago," Mr. Davies explained. "He told me it contained financial records and a secondary notarized affidavit detailing his wishes, specifically naming the trust and confirming his sound mental state at the time of its execution. He wanted absolute proof of his intent, just in case Eleanor tried to claim undue influence in his final weeks. George had thought of everything. He hadn't just built a shield, he had armed me with a sword and a full inventory of ammunition." We immediately drove to the bank. After presenting George's death certificate and the trust documents establishing me as the sole heir and inheritor of his safe deposit contents, the bank manager led us into the vault. The box was small and heavy. Inside, nestled beneath thick stacks of consolidated financial statements, proving Eleanor's attempts to access George's liquid assets were rebuffed, was a final document. It was a video deposition transcript, notarized and dated, where George, looking frail but utterly lucid, spoke directly to the camera, confirming his love for me, his granddaughter, and his explicit intent to leave me the house via the trust, expressing his distrust of Eleanor's motives. "This," Mr. Davies said, tapping the transcript, "is the final nail. It proves intent, capacity, and foresight. Eleanor has no legal leg to stand on, and we can now pursue charges for obstruction and potentially fraud." I looked at the transcript, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over me. George had not just left me an inheritance, he had left me justice. The time for grieving in silence was indeed over. The despair was gone, replaced by the focused resolve of a commanding officer preparing for engagement. "What's the next step, Mr. Davies?" I asked, folding the transcript neatly. My voice was calm and steady. "We go back to your house, Ms. Vance. We serve her with the eviction notice and the full legal paperwork. We give her 1 hour to vacate the premises. It's time for the reckoning." I nodded, feeling a grim satisfaction. I was going back to the lake house, but this time I was coming home as the rightful owner, armed with the undeniable truth George had so cleverly protected for me. Eleanor's smug reign of indifference was about to end. I was ready to take back what was mine. The drive back to the lake house felt completely different from my panicked journey just yesterday. I was no longer a fugitive, heartbroken and seeking solace in a silent church pew. I was a returning commander, armed with the truth and the unshakable foundation of George's love. Mr. Davies drove, his presence a solid, reassuring weight beside me. He spoke little, offering only precise legal counsel, which I absorbed like naval strategy. The manila envelope, now empty of its documents, rested in the inner pocket of my jacket, but its weight felt transferred to my core, a new, fierce resolve. "Keep your emotions in check, Sarah," Mr. Davies advised, his voice measured as we turned onto the familiar road. "Eleanor will try to provoke you. She will deny, she will rage, and she will attempt to manipulate. Let me handle the legal delivery. You are simply the physical manifestation of the trust." "I understand, sir," I replied, my voice steady. The old, trembling fear was gone, replaced by the cool, focused clarity I used to feel before a major operation at sea. I had faced storms, mechanical failures, and hostile waters. A desperate stepmother was certainly manageable. When we rounded the final bend, the house looked the same, sprawling, shingled, and nestled perfectly by the deep blue water of the lake. But now, it didn't look like Eleanor's house. It looked like mine. Her sleek black sedan still sat arrogantly in the driveway. I parked the rental car carefully behind it, taking a deep, cold breath of the upstate New York air. We walked up the stone path, the crunch of gravel under our feet sounding loud and deliberate. I didn't bother to knock. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped across the threshold, Mr. Davies following closely behind. Eleanor was exactly where I had expected her to be, holding court in the sunlit living room. She was perched on the edge of George's antique sofa, talking animatedly into her phone, a crystal wine glass balanced precariously on the armrest. She was dressed in the same expensive silk I had seen before, her blonde hair immaculate. She looked utterly complacent, secure in her stolen domain. She glanced up, annoyance immediately clouding her features at the sight of me, and then a flicker of genuine alarm when she saw the sharp, professional face of Mr. Davies. "I told you, Sarah, I am busy," she snapped into the phone, then abruptly ended the call without waiting for a reply. She stood up, smoothing the expensive fabric of her dress. "You are trespassing. I demand you leave this instant." I didn't move. I simply stood my ground, my eyes locked on hers, allowing a lifetime of hidden resentment and this week's brutal betrayal to harden my expression. Mr. Davies stepped forward, his briefcase clicking open with a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden silence. He pulled out a stack of documents, bound neatly with red tape. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice formal and utterly devoid of emotion, "I am Mr. Davies, representing the estate of George Vance and his granddaughter, Ms. Sarah Vance. We are not trespassing. We are reclaiming legally designated property." Eleanor's smile was thin, edged with contempt. "Oh, I see. You found a cheap ambulance chaser, Sarah? How pathetic. I have the legally signed will right here. George left me everything. You got the rusty fishing lures. Now, get out." I watched as Mr. Davies ignored her theatrical dismissal. He placed the documents, the certified copy of the irrevocable trust, the property deed reflecting the automatic transfer of ownership, and the official eviction notice, on the mahogany coffee table between us. "The document you possess, Mrs. Vance, is superseded by an irrevocable trust established by Mr. Vance in 2015, Mr. Davies stated, his finger tapping the top page. The terms of this trust explicitly named Ms. Sarah Vance as the sole beneficiary of this property, effective immediately upon Mr. Vance's passing. That transfer occurred 3 weeks ago. Legally, you have been residing in Ms. Vance's home without permission. The transformation in Eleanor's face was instantaneous and breathtaking. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her porcelain skin stark white. Her smug composure shattered, replaced by a raw, naked panic. She snatched the documents, her manicured nails digging into the paper, and began scanning the dense legal text. "No, no, this is impossible," she gasped, her voice suddenly high and reedy, completely losing the practiced, smooth drawl. "This is a forgery. George would never—" "Your grandfather was exceptionally meticulous, Eleanor," I interjected, finally speaking, my voice low and steady, cutting through her mounting hysteria. "He knew exactly what you were capable of. He protected me, even when I was thousands of miles away." She looked up at me then, her eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and profound terror. She finally understood the depth of her failure. George hadn't just died, he had outsmarted her. "You little tramp!" she shrieked, throwing the documents onto the floor. "I took care of him. I was here. You abandoned him for 5 years. That house belongs to me." Mr. Davies remained utterly calm, a rock in the storm of her rage. "Whether you were present or not, Mrs. Vance, is irrelevant to the legal standing of the trust. Furthermore, we are prepared to notify the authorities regarding the concealment of Mr. Vance's death and the deliberate presentation of a superseded will, which constitutes serious obstruction of inheritance and potential fraud." The word authorities hit her like a physical blow. Her fury immediately retreated, replaced by a calculating fear. She couldn't afford a public scandal. Her carefully constructed life was built on fragile social standing and appearances. Mr. Davies checked his watch. "You have exactly 1 hour, Mrs. Vance, to collect your personal effects. Any items remaining after that time will be documented and stored at your expense, pending retrieval." Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, breathing heavily, her chest heaving beneath the expensive silk. I watched her, not with triumph, but with a detached sense of justice being served. She was suddenly small and pathetic, stripped of the power she had wielded so cruelly. She didn't utter another word to me. She spun on her heel and stormed up the stairs, the sound of her expensive heels clicking angrily on the polished wood. The next hour was surreal. Mr. Davies and I stood silently in the living room, listening to the frantic sounds of Eleanor packing. She wasn't packing memories. She was packing assets. I heard the clinking of jewelry, the zipping of designer luggage, and the occasional crash of something she knocked over in her haste. I walked over to the mantelpiece. The small, dusty wooden tackle box, the inheritance she had sneeringly offered me, was still there. I picked it up. It felt solid and real in my hands, unlike the fleeting, greedy ownership Eleanor had claimed. I ran my thumb over the worn wood. This box represented George's heart, something Eleanor could never understand, let alone steal. When Eleanor finally descended the stairs, she was hauling 3 enormous suitcases and a high-end leather tote bag, clearly filled with valuables. She looked disheveled, her meticulous hairstyle slightly mussed, her face still blotchy with fury. She paused at the front door, turning back to face me one last time. There was no apology, no remorse, only pure, distilled hatred. "You may have this house now, Sarah," she spat, her voice a low snarl. "But you gave up 5 years of your life for the Navy. You missed him. You missed everything. You'll be alone in this oversized mausoleum." I met her gaze evenly. "I was never alone, Eleanor. George made sure of that. The difference between you and me is that I have his love, and all you have are those suitcases." She flinched, recognizing the truth in my words. She didn't respond. She just yanked the door open, struggling to drag her heavy luggage out to the black sedan. Mr. Davies and I watched from the doorway as she wrestled the bags into the trunk. The engine roared to life, and the sedan peeled out of the driveway, spitting gravel, disappearing around the bend in a cloud of dust. And then, silence. Profound, absolute silence settled over the house. The tension that had coiled in my stomach since the moment I stepped off the plane finally unwound. Mr. Davies closed the front door gently. "It is done, Ms. Vance," he said softly, a hint of warmth finally entering his professional tone. "The house is legally and physically yours." I nodded, unable to speak, the sudden quiet almost overwhelming. I walked slowly back into the living room, the space now feeling vast and clean. The air no longer smelled of Eleanor's heavy perfume, but of old wood, dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun, and the familiar, faint scent of lake water carried in through the closed windows. It smelled like George. It smelled like home. I sat down in George's armchair, the leather worn smooth beneath my fingers. I didn't feel triumphant or victorious. I felt exhausted, yes, but also intensely connected. I closed my eyes and allowed myself the first moment of genuine, peaceful grief since arriving home. George hadn't just left me a house. He had left me a fortress. He had anticipated the storm and built the sea walls strong enough to protect me. He knew I needed a solid base to return to after my time at sea, a place where I could anchor myself again. I opened my eyes and looked out the window. The lake was sparkling, calm, and welcoming. I picked up the tackle box again. It contained not just lures, but memories, stories of fishing trips, lessons in patience, and George's steady hand guiding mine. I realized the reckoning wasn't just about Eleanor losing the house. It was about me finally accepting George's lasting gift. He hadn't abandoned me. He had planned for my future with a deep, strategic love. Tomorrow, I would call the shipyard. It was time to pull the old family sloop out of storage. I had a home now, and I had a promise to keep. I was finally ready to learn how to sail. I was finally home.